I've spent the last like 36 hours almost shooting with the new Sony Alpha 1. So I'm going to quickly tell you what my hands-on impressions are and how it compares to the Canon R5. But one thing I can't do is show you pictures or video from it because there is an embargo until February 4th. But I can still tell you how it behaves, what I liked, what I don't like, what works and what doesn't work. And there were some amazing things about it, but there's also some disappointments that might make you hold out on placing the pre-order. Use this link to pre-order it. Be sure to subscribe for my image quality tests, the video quality tests, testing of the Wi-Fi and tethering, as well as side-by-side comparisons with the Sony A9 Mark II, the R5, the A7R4, and the Nikon Z7 II. Visit winthiscamera.com to actually win one of those cool cameras for free, and visit northrup.photo, where we have photography training 50% off for Valentine's Day. And that's going to make a bigger difference than upgrading your camera. It's also way cheaper. The electronic viewfinder on this is amazing. It's the best electronic viewfinder I've ever used. It's the same as in the A7S III if you've used that, except it's faster, it's quicker. There is no real lag to it at all. I was able to track a moving bird and not lose it. Even following a fast moving bird for more than 10 seconds while continuously shooting, no problem at all. That has been a problem on every other camera except for the Canon R5 and R6. So it's at least in that caliber. If you're shooting with an A7 III and A7R4, even a Sony A9 or an A9 Mark II, this EVF might be worth the upgrade for sports and action. It is equal to an optical viewfinder, except in all the ways that it's superior, like giving you real-time previews of the exposure, allowing you to review pictures in the viewfinder when it's too sunny to see the screen, that kind of thing. It's really one of the biggest benefits of this camera. It also just feels bigger than the Canon R5 and R6. Like it's higher resolution than the R5, but it's also physically larger. It's amazing to look through. It's better than an optical viewfinder. The handling on this camera is very good. It feels solid. The grip, maybe it's a little bit deeper than an A9, but the early complaints about Sony mirrorless cameras that they were too small, none of those exist with this. It just feels good. I will say it has a tilt screen and not a flip screen. In fact, the tilt screen does not tilt to the side, and this is a huge drawback. Often I'm shooting landscape photography and I want to get near to the ground, but I'm thinking of vertical prints, like maybe for Instagram. And especially out in the sun, I just can't see the screen without having to actually get on the ground. If it tilted out from the side, that would fix that problem. It has some weird little quirks. Like Sony always has some kind of dumb stuff in the menus that makes me like scratch my head. Like right out of the box, when you go into the function menu, which is this quick access menu where you change important settings, two of the settings don't work at all, because they're duplicated by hardware buttons. So when you select them, it just says you can't use it. Now you can update it, but it's just like, it shows a lack of testing or something that is the default and it does not work. I find that the custom 3 button, the C3 button here, frequently gets pressed just accidentally. And by default, it's configured to change between automatic shutter, mechanical shutter, and electronic shutter. It is something you want to frequently change, but twice today, I switched it from an electronic shutter to a manual shutter accidentally because it just bumped against something while I was using it. The menu systems themselves are improved from earlier Sony cameras. It has the A7S III menu system. It is better. Still, I don't like it quite as good as Canon, but at least you can touch it and stuff. This camera does have a shutter that can be configured to close over the sensor, which should keep it more clean. Let's talk about the autofocus. This is a huge update. They crammed 2 super powerful processors in here and a super fast refresh rate on the sensor. The tracking, the subject tracking, what they call the real-time AF, is better than in any other camera from Sony, significantly. In like my Sony A7R4 or my Sony A9 Mark II, when I use the real-time tracking, it will track a single subject for usually like 3 seconds or so. And I use that for focus recompose. When I'm shooting sports, I'll put it over the player I want to shoot, hold down the AF on button, shoot, 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 and it will track them until it inevitably jumps off to another player or something in the background. Like I said, on average, probably takes 3 seconds. And then I hit the button again, I reset it, and it keeps shooting. The average is probably more like 10 seconds. So it is much stickier, but it will inevitably wander onto the foreground or background, even with a completely still subject. So it's not perfect, but it's very good. I would say it's on par with the Canon R5 and R6, and then better than every other Sony camera. And it's better than like Nikon's 3D tracking and the D500 and D850 DSLR. So that means like I give it a rating of awesome. The human eye AF has been good in the other Sony cameras, and it continues to be very good here. It still has what my friend Jared Polin calls eyelash AF, where it tends to autofocus on something in the foreground. Eye AF doesn't actually autofocus on the eye. Instead, what it does is IAF chooses the focusing point closest to an eye, and then it just focuses on the first thing under that focusing point. But the actual moving of the motor forward and backwards doesn't have the intelligence to say, okay, this is the iris of the eye. I need to make sure the iris is sharp. It could through contrast detection and phase detection working together, but it currently does not in any camera. So like every, especially high resolution camera with shallow depth of field, you see this like continuous front focusing with humans. It also happens with what they call animal IAF. You have to switch between 3 different modes manually: human, animal, and birds. If you put it in animal IAF, it does a good job of picking up people. So you can kind of leave it in animal IAF and that seems okay. Animal IAF should add in like mammals, like dogs, cats, squirrels, and that works pretty good, though we have the same problem where it will front focus. So if I'm close to my big Labradoodle and her eye is big in the frame, it will nail focus on her eye. If her nose moves and there are some hairs poking in front of her eye, it will just focus on those hairs instead. You kind of can't use the automatic mode if there's going to be anything maybe blocking the eye. It's just not quite that smart yet on any camera. The bird IAF is a brand new feature. This is the first time we're seeing it in a Sony camera. And it's not great. If you're photographing a bird, it will occasionally pop up and find the eye. Some birds, it never finds the eye. Other birds, it seems to find it all the time. It depends on the size of the bird in the frame, the colors of the bird, the backlighting, but it's not reliable enough to use. Now, the Canon camera, the Canon R5 and R6 on the other hand, they will find the form of the bird and drop a box around it, and then anytime it sees the eye, it shifts that focusing right to the eye. It seems to like lock on with psychic powers. This is not that good. What I found worked best for bird photography was to use the real-time tracking AF, just the center point, and then put that over the bird, hold down my AF on button, and recompose as I wanted. And like I said, it does a very good job of tracking it. With the bird IF on, it's working in the background. So if it sees an eye near where my focusing point is, it will jump from my tracking point, which might be on the body of the bird, over to the eye. But you'll see it'll like pop in every now and then disappear, and it just reverts back to its previous tracking. So this ends up working well. It's not quite as seamless and intuitive as the Canon, but I did find it got the job done. With that said, I had a lot of missed focus shots using the Sony 600mm f4. I'm going to want to spend some more time testing it because it was very cold today, and I don't know if maybe atmospheric conditions might have affected something. So consider this a preliminary effort based on a day and a half of shooting. When shooting flying birds at either with a 600mm f4 with perhaps a 1.4 or 2 times teleconverter, I found the hunting to be real difficult. Now, if you're not a bird photographer, if something's out of focus at 600mm and f4, you don't see it at all. You have to be kind of close to the focal plane before a flying bird will even appear as a fuzzy shape. So what you end up doing is pre-focusing. You'll pick a tree that's about the same distance as the bird, focus on it, and then you can line your shot up and you'll see it fuzzy, and then the camera's autofocus system takes over, getting it precisely in focus. Repeatedly, what happened with the Sony Alpha 1 is I would do that, and if it wasn't almost exactly in focus, if it was a little bit blurry, it would pull focus in the wrong direction. So I would hit the AF on button and it would go more out of focus and I would lose it completely. This happened about half the time. This camera has an amazing frames per second, but it might not be what's advertised. In high plus mode, this camera is advertised as shooting 30 frames per second with continuous autofocus. When I did that on a completely still subject, I indeed got 29 to 30 frames per second. Excellent, better than any other camera out there, particularly amazing considering their 50 megapixel pictures. However, tracking moving birds with a 600mm f4 and a teleconverter, this number dropped significantly. The best I got was about 19 frames per second, and I frequently got less than that. But I have to draw a direct comparison to the Canon R5, which advertises 20 frames per second and consistently delivers 20 frames per second, even with a 600 f4, even with a 2x teleconverter. So just because this is advertised as having 50% more frames per second, doesn't seem like it actually outperforms the R5 in the action scenarios in the real world. If you use a non-Sony lens, it is hard-coded to drop down to lower frame rates. Specifically, the best it's going to do is 15 frames per second. Now, it might not be able to do any more than that because of like limitations of how long it takes to autofocus. It's really tough to actually autofocus and keep up with 30 frames per second. That gives you a tiny fraction of a second to actually move the motors so that you can shoot again, right? There's a concern when using an electronic shutter, which this camera does by default, with fast moving subjects or with fast panning. If you watched our Nikon Z7 II review, you saw that the rolling shutter was completely unbearable, meaning I would never use the electronic shutter while shooting action. This camera, I could detect basically no rolling shutter, even doing my best to create it, even just doing whip pans while shooting stills at 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. There was really no detectable rolling shutter. So I think rolling shutter for stills is simply not a concern. I've not tested rolling shutter for video yet. The banding on it can be very under control, but it is not fixed. They do have an anti-flicker feature in there, and they talked about this, but I did not find that it fixed the banding problem under artificial lights with fast shutter speeds. You're in a stadium at night or indoors under artificial lights, and you're shooting with a fast shutter speed, like 1/2000th, 1/2500th, 1/3000th of a second. The flickering of the lights will create bands of light going down, and this was actually pretty under control if you went into the menu system and you chose the feature where you can fine-tune the shutter. I was able to get like 13385 was the shutter speed, I think, and the banding was not bad at all, not really noticeable with the electronic shutter. Oddly, when I switched to the mechanical shutter, there I saw more banding under these particular lights. So the tuning is helpful. The anti-flicker is pretty under control if you take the time to actually tune it. Sports photographers shooting indoors can use this, but don't forget to check for the banding as the sun sets and the lights come up, because some adjustments might really improve your shot if you're using fast shutter speeds like over 1/2000th of a second. The buffer on this is no longer an issue. Every single Sony camera prior to this, the A9 Mark II, the A7R4, the A7 III, if you shot continuously for a while, the buffer would fill up, and then sometimes it would take more than 2 minutes to write the buffer to the card. I'm shooting with two CF Express Type A cards, writing to both of them, and buffering is simply not an issue. Like, I can fill the buffer up after like 3 or 4 seconds, but then if I keep shooting, it keeps shooting at a pretty good pace. Like, it'll go from 30 frames per second to maybe like 10 frames per second. Still doing okay. So you don't completely miss out on the action if you do have to lean on the shutter for a long time. And then on other cameras, other Sony cameras, once it's buffering, you can't jump into the menus. You can't change some other settings. By the time I got the camera away from my eye and I went to open up the menu, the buffer would be empty. Thus, congratulations, Sony. You have fixed a long-running, annoying problem. You can see I have some stats here. I managed to take about 260 pictures over 11 seconds of a still subject. So that's about 22 frames per second. That includes way overrunning the buffer. So you can see that after you fill up the buffer, it can continue to shoot at a really, really fast pace. The battery life has been excellent when shooting stills. Today it was 19 degrees Fahrenheit or about -7 degrees Celsius, and I was out for several hours with it. I took 5,500 shots shooting birds and flying birds. I was leaning heavier on the shutter because I wanted to test that aspect of it. I wouldn't normally take that many pictures. And after I was done, the battery was at 69%. Haha. Anyway, that I think is fine. That means I would be comfortable shooting an entire soccer game or multiple games back to back on even a single battery, even in worst case cold situations. Recording 23 minutes of 8K burned through 17% of the battery. So indeed, the video does go through the battery a little bit faster, but you can still record for quite a long time. One of the new features it advertises is the ability to fire the flash with the electronic shutters at up to 1/200th of a second. I tested this and it did work. The mechanical shutter does fire the flash with no sync problems up to 1/400th of a second. When you go above those shutter speeds, it will automatically switch to high-speed sync. It also does a nice thing where once you attach the flash, it changes the viewfinder mode, so you're no longer previewing the exposure without the flash. It'll just operate like a DSLR where it just shows you a nice bright image instead of trying to preview the exposure, which a lot of other mirrorless cameras do. So basically, it just works entirely seamlessly in the studio. When I connected a generic flash, like a single pin flash, not specifically designed for Sony compatibility, the behavior reverted to that of older cameras. With the electronic shutter enabled, it did not fire the generic flash. With the mechanical shutter enabled, I was limited to a sync speed of 1/250th of a second, and when I went shorter than that, faster than that, I started getting the black bands that meant that the sync was not working. So, if you want to take advantage of the electronic shutter with the flash or the faster sync speed, be sure you have flashes designed for Sony. I'm using a Godox flash, a wireless trigger designed for Sony. So it doesn't have to be a Sony branded flash. You can use generic. The 8K overheating, in standard mode, it warned me after 15 minutes and overheated in 16 minutes. But you can go into the menus and put it into a high mode where it will just tolerate more heat before it shuts down. In high temperature mode, it recorded for about an hour 20, broken up into 3 separate segments, just as I quickly replaced a dead battery. If you want to win a free camera like a Sony a7R IV, go to winthiscamera.com. We're literally just giving it away. And if you want to actually learn photography, go to northrup.photo, where we have a 50% off sale on our video training, as well as presets, cool hats, masks, t-shirts. In the comments down below, let me know what else you want me to test on this, because I'm continuing to test it and I will answer your questions if you have them. I'd like to know, would you pick this or the Canon R5? The Canon R5, $3,900. Thought that was super expensive when it was launched, but compared to $6,500, actually seems like a real deal, right? Especially because in the real world, it seems to match up in most of the scenarios, at least until we do some more testing. Subscribe to see our upcoming full review, and go to winthiscamera.com to win a Sony a7R IV or a Nikon Z7 Mark II or a Canon R5. It is wrapping up in just, well, tomorrow. It's today. When you watch this, it's the last day that you can do this. Also head to northrup.photo to get 50% off our video training for our Valentine's Day sale. And I promise actually learning photography is going to make a bigger difference in your pictures than upgrading your camera will. Bye.